The Magic Casket by R. Austin Freeman. It was in the near neighbourhood of King's Road, Chelsea, that chance, aided by Thorndike's sharp and observant eyes, introduced us to the dramatic story of the Magic Casket. Not that there was anything strikingly dramatic in the opening phase of the affair, nor even in the story of the casket itself. It was Thorndike who added the dramatic touch, and most of the magic too, and I record the affair principally as an illustration of his extraordinary capacity for producing odd items of out-of-the-way knowledge and instantly applying them in the most unexpected manner. 8 o'clock had struck, on a misty November night when we turned out of the main road, and leaving behind the glare of the shop windows, plunged into the maze of dark and narrow streets to the north. The abrupt change impressed us both, and Thorndike proceeded to moralize on it in his pleasant, reflective fashion. "London is an inexhaustible place," he mused. "Its variety is infinite. A minute ago we walked in a glare of light, jostled by a multitude, and now look at this little street. It is as dim as a tunnel, and we have got it absolutely to ourselves. Anything might happen in a place like this." Suddenly he stopped. We were, at the moment, passing a small church or chapel, the west door of which was enclosed in an open porch, and as my observant friend stepped into the latter and stooped, I perceived, in the deep shadow against the wall, the object which had evidently caught his eye. "What is it?" I asked, following him in. "It's a handbag," he replied, "and the question is, what is it doing here?" He tried the church door, which was obviously locked, and coming out looked at the windows. "There are no lights in the church," said he. "The place is locked up, and there's nobody in sight. Apparently the bag is derelict. Shall we have a look at it?" Without waiting for an answer, he picked it up and brought it out into the mitigated darkness of the street, where we proceeded to inspect it. But at the first glance it told its own tale, for it had evidently been locked, and it bore unmistakable traces of having been forced open. "It isn't empty," said Thorndike. "I think we had better see what is in it. Just catch hold while I get a light." He handed me the bag while he felt in his pocket for the tiny electric lamp which he made a habit of carrying, and an excellent habit it is. I held the mouth of the bag open while he illuminated the interior, which we then saw to be occupied by several objects neatly wrapped in brown paper. One of these Thorndike lifted out, and untying the string and removing the paper, displayed a Chinese stoneware jar. Attached to it was a label bearing the stamp of the Victoria and Albert Museum, on which was written, "Miss Mabel Bonnet, 168 Willow Road, Fulham Road, West." "That tells us all we want to know," said Thorndike, rewrapping the jar and tenderly replacing it in the bag. "We can't do wrong in delivering the things to their owner, especially as the bag itself is evidently her property too," and he pointed to the gilt initials M.B. stamped on the morocco. It took us but a few minutes to reach the Fulham Road, but when we then had to walk nearly a mile along that thoroughfare before we arrived at Willow Walk, to which an obliging shopkeeper had directed us, and naturally number 168 was at the farther end. As we turned into the quiet street, we almost collided with two men who were walking at a rapid pace, but both looking back over their shoulders. I noticed that they were both Japanese, well-dressed, gentlemanly-looking men, but I gave them little attention, being interested rather in what they were looking at. This was a taxicab, which was dimly visible by the light of a street lamp at the farther end of the walk, and from which 4 persons had just alighted. 2 of these had hurried ahead to knock at a door, while the other 2 walked very slowly across the pavement and up the steps to the threshold. Almost immediately the door was opened, 2 of the shadowy figures entered, and the other 2 returned slowly to the cab, and as we came nearer, I could see that these latter were policemen in uniform. I had just time to note this fact when they both got into the cab and were forthwith spirited away. "Looks like a street accident of some kind," I remarked. And then, as I glanced at the number of the house we were passing, I added, "Now, I wonder if that house happens to be—" "Yes, by Jove, it is. It is 168. Things have been happening, and this bag of ours is one of the dramatis personae." The response to our knock was by no means prompt. I was, in fact, in the act of raising my hand to the knocker to repeat the summons, when the door opened and revealed an elderly servant-maid, who regarded us inquiringly, and, as I thought, with something approaching alarm. "Does Miss Mabel Bonney live here?" Thorndike asked. "Yes, sir," was the reply, "but I'm afraid you can't see her just now, unless it's something urgent. She's rather upset and particularly engaged at present." "There is no occasion whatever to disturb her," said Thorndike. "We have merely called to restore this bag, which seemed to have been lost." And with this he held it out towards her. She grasped it eagerly with a cry of surprise, and as the mouth fell open, she peered into it. "Why," she exclaimed, "they don't seem to have taken anything after all. Where did you find it, sir?" "In the porch of a church in Spelton Street," Thorndike replied, and was turning away when the servant said earnestly, "Would you kindly give me your name and address, sir? Miss Bonney will wish to write and thank you." "There's really no need," said he, but she interrupted anxiously. "If you would be so kind, sir. Miss Bonney will be so vexed if she's unable to thank you, and besides, she may want to ask you some questions about it." "That is true," said Thorndike, who was restrained only by good manners from asking one or two questions himself. He produced his card-case, and having handed one of his cards to the maid, wished her good evening, and retired. "That bag had evidently been pinched," I remarked, as we walked back towards the Fulham Road. "Evidently," he agreed, and was about to enlarge on the matter when our attention was attracted to a taxi which was approaching from the direction of the main road. A man's head was thrust out of the window, and as the vehicle passed a street lamp, I observed that the head appertained to an elderly gentleman with very white hair and a very fresh face. "Did you see who that was?" Thorndike asked. "Looked like old Broadribb," I replied. "It did, very much. I wonder where he's off to." He turned and followed with a speculative eye the receding taxi, which presently swept alongside the curb and stopped, apparently opposite the house from where we had just come. As the vehicle came to rest, the door flew open, and the passenger shot out like an elderly but agile jack-in-the-box, and bounced up the steps. "That is Broadribb's knock, sure enough," said I, as the old-fashioned flourish reverberated up the quiet street. "I've heard it too often on our own knocker to mistake it. But we had better not let him see us watching him." As we went once more on our way, I took a sly glance now and again at my friend, noting with a certain malicious enjoyment his profoundly cogitative air. I knew quite well what was happening in his mind, for his mind reacted to observed facts in an invariable manner. And here was a group of related facts. The bag stolen but deposited intact, the museum label, the injured or sick person, probably Miss Bonney herself, brought home under police escort, and the arrival post-haste of the old lawyer. A significant group of facts. And there was Thorndike, under my amused and attentive observation, fitting them together in various combinations to see what general conclusion emerged. Apparently my own mental state was equally clear to him, for he remarked presently, as if response to an unspoken comment, "Well, I expect we shall know all about it before many days have passed if Broadribb sees my card, as he most probably will. Here comes an omnibus that'll suit us. Shall we hop on?" He stood at the curb and raised his stick, and as the accommodation on the omnibus was such that our seats were separated, there was no opportunity to pursue the subject further, even if there had been anything to discuss. But Thorndike's prediction was justified sooner than I had expected, for we had not long finished our supper, and had not yet closed the oak, when there was heard a mighty flourish on the knocker of our inner door. "Broadribb, by jingo!" I exclaimed, and hurried across the room to let him in. "No, Jervis," he said as I invited him to enter. "I'm not coming in. Don't want to disturb you at this time of night. I've just called to make an appointment for tomorrow with a client." "Is the client's name Bonnie?" I asked. He started and gazed at me in astonishment. "Gad, Jervis," he exclaimed, "you are getting as bad as Thorndike. How the deuce did you know that she was my client?" "Never mind how I know. It's our business to know everything in these chambers. But if your appointment concerns Miss Mabel Bonnie, for the Lord's sake, come in and give Thorndike a chance of a night's rest. At present he's on broken bottles, as Mr. Bumble would express it." On this persuasion, Mr. Broadribb entered, nothing loath, very much the reverse in fact, and having bestowed a jovial greeting on Thorndike, glanced approvingly round the room. "Ha," said he, "you look very cosy. If you're really sure I'm not—" I cut him short by propelling him gently towards the fire, beside which I deposited him in an easy-chair, while Thorndike pressed the electric bell which rang up in the laboratory. "Well," said Broadribb, spreading himself out comfortably before the fire like a handsome old tomcat, "if you're going to let me give you a few particulars, but perhaps you would rather that I should not talk shop." "Now you know perfectly well, Broadribb," said Thorndike, "that shop is the breath of life to us all. Let us have these particulars." Broadribb sighed contentedly and placed his toes on the fender, and at this moment the door opened softly and Polton looked into the room. He took a single, understanding glance at our visitor and withdrew, shutting the door without a sound. "I am glad," pursued Broadribb, "to have this opportunity of a preliminary chat, because there are certain things that one can say better when a client is not present, and I am deeply interested in Bonnie's affairs. The crisis in those affairs which has brought me here is of quite a recent date. In fact, it dates from this evening, but I know your partiality for having events related in their proper sequence. So I will leave today's happenings for the moment and tell you the story, the whole of which is material to the case, from the beginning." Here there was a slight interruption, due to Polton's noiseless entry with a tray on which was a decanter, a biscuit box, and 3 port glasses. This he deposited on a small table, which he placed within convenient reach of our guest. Then, with a glance of altruistic satisfaction at our old friend, he stole out like a benevolent ghost. "Dear, dear," exclaimed Broadribb, beaming on the decanter, "this is really too bad. You ought not to indulge me in this way." "My dear Broadribb," replied Thorndike, "you are a benefactor to us. You give us a pretext for taking a glass of port. We can't drink alone, you know." "I should, if I had a cellar like yours," chuckled Broadribb, sniffing ecstatically at his glass. He took a sip with his eyes closed, savoured it solemnly, shook his head, and set the glass down on the table. "To return to our case," he resumed. "Miss Bonnie is the daughter of a solicitor, Harold Bonnie. You may remember him. He had offices in Bedford Row, and there, one morning, a client came to him and asked him to take care of some property while he, the said client, ran over to Paris, where he had some urgent business. The property in question was a collection of pearls of the most unusual size and value, forming a great necklace which had been unstrung for the sake of portability. It is not clear where they came from, but as the transaction occurred soon after the Russian Revolution, we may make a guess. At any rate, there they were, packed loosely in a leather bag, the string of which was sealed with the owner's seal. Bonnie seems to have been rather casual about the affair. He gave the client a receipt for the bag, stating the nature of the contents which he had not seen, and deposited it, in the client's presence, in the safe of his private office. Perhaps he intended to take it to the bank or transfer it to his strong-room, but it is evident that he did neither, for his managing clerk, who kept the second key of the strong-room, without which the room could not be opened, knew nothing of the transaction. When he went home at about 7 o'clock, he left Bonnie hard at work in his office, and there is no doubt that the pearls were still in the safe. That night, at about 8:45, It appeared that a couple of CID officers were walking up Bedford Row when they saw 3 men come out of one of the houses. 2 of them turned up towards Theobald's Road, but the third came south towards them. As he passed them, they both recognized him as a Japanese named Uyenishi, who was believed to be a member of a cosmopolitan gang and whom the police were keeping under observation. Naturally, their suspicions were aroused. The first 2 men had hurried round the corner and were out of sight, and when they turned to look after Uyenishi, he had mended his pace considerably and was looking back at them. Thereupon, one of the officers, named Barker, decided to follow the Jap, while the other, Holt, reconnoitred the premises. Now, as soon as Barker turned, the Japanese broke into a run. It was just such a night as this, and slightly foggy. In order to keep his man in sight, he had to run too, and he found that he had a sprinter to deal with. From the bottom of Bedford Row, Uyenishi darted across and shot down Hand Court like a lamplighter. Barker followed, but at the Holborn end his man was nowhere to be seen. However, he presently learned from a man at the shop door that the fugitive had run past and turned up Brownlow Street, so off he went again in pursuit. But when he got to the top of the street, back in Bedford Row, he was done. There was no sign of the man, and no one about from whom he could make inquiries. All he could do was to cross the road and walk up Bedford Row to see if Holt had made any discoveries. As he was trying to identify the house, his colleague came out onto the doorstep and beckoned him in, and this was the story that he told. He had recognized the house by the big lamp standard, and as the place was all dark, he had gone into the entry and tried the office door. Finding it unlocked, he had entered the clerk's office, lit the gas, and tried the door of the private office, but found it locked. He knocked at it, but getting no answer, had a good look round at the clerk's office, and there presently on the floor in a dark corner he found a key. This he tried in the door of the private office, and finding that it fitted, turned it and opened the door. As he did so, the light from the outer office fell upon the body of a man lying on the floor just inside. A moment's inspection showed that the man had been murdered, first knocked on the head and then finished with a knife. Examination of the pockets showed that the dead man was Harold Bonney, and also that no robbery from the person seemed to have been committed. Nor was there any sign of any other kind of robbery. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed, and the safe had not been broken into, though that was not very conclusive, as the safe key was in the dead man's pocket. However, a murder had been committed, and obviously Uyenishi was either the murderer or an accessory. So Holt had at once rung up Scotland Yard on the office telephone, giving all the particulars. I may say at once that Uyenishi disappeared completely. He never went to his lodgings at Limehouse, for the police were there before he could have arrived. A lively hue and cry was kept up. Photographs of the wanted man were posted outside every police station, and a watch was set on all the ports, but he was never found. He must have got away at once on some outward-bound tramp from the Thames, and there we will leave him for the moment. At first it was thought that nothing had been stolen, since the managing clerk could not discover that anything was missing. But a few days later, the client returned from Paris, and presenting his receipt, asked for his pearls, but the pearls had vanished. Clearly they had been the object of the crime. The robbers must have known about them and traced them to the office. Of course, the safe had been opened with its own key, which was then replaced in the dead man's pocket. Now, I was poor Bonnie's executor, and in that capacity I denied his liability in respect of the pearls on the ground that he was a gratuitous bailee, there being no evidence that any consideration had been demanded, and that being murdered cannot be construed as negligence. But Miss Mabel, who was practically the sole legatee, insisted on accepting liability. She said that the pearls could have been secured in the bank or the strong room, and that she was morally, if not legally, liable for their loss, and she insisted on handing to the owner the full amount at which he valued them. It was a wildly foolish proceeding, for he would certainly have accepted half the sum. But still, I take my hat off to a person, man or woman, who can accept poverty in preference to a broken covenant. And here Broadribb, being in fact that sort of person himself, had to be consoled with a replenished glass. "And mind you," he resumed, "when I speak of poverty, I wish to be taken literally. The estimated value of those pearls was £50,000, if you can imagine anyone out of Bedlam giving such a money for a parcel of trash like that. And when poor Mabel Bonney had paid it, she was left with the prospect of having to spread her butter mighty thin for the rest of her life. As a matter of fact, she has had to sell one after another of her little treasures to pay just her current expenses, and I'm hanged if I can see how she is going to carry on when she has sold the last of them. But there, I mustn't take up your time with her private troubles. Let us return to our muttons. First, as to the pearls, they were never traced, and it seems probable that they were never disposed of. For you see, pearls are different from any other kind of gems. You can cut up a big diamond, but you can't cut up a big pearl. And the great value of this necklace was due not only to the size, the perfect shape and orient of the separate pearls, but to the fact that the whole set was perfectly matched. To break up the necklace was to destroy a good part of its value. And now, as to our friend Uyenishi. He disappeared, as I have said, but he reappeared at Los Angeles in custody of the police, charged with robbery and murder. He was taken red-handed, and duly convicted and sentenced to death. But for some reason, or more probably for no reason, as we should think, the sentence was commuted to imprisonment for life. Under these circumstances, the English police naturally took no action, especially as they really had no evidence against him. Now, Uyenishi was, by trade, a metal worker, a maker of those pretty trifles that are so dear to the artistic Japanese, and when he was in prison, he was allowed to set up a little workshop and practice his trade on a small scale. Among other things that he made was a little casket in the form of a seated figure, which he said he wanted to give to his brother as a keepsake. I don't know whether any permission was granted for him to make this gift, but that is of no consequence, for Uyenishi got influenza and was carried off in a few days by pneumonia, and the prison authorities learned that his brother had been killed a week or two previously in a shooting affair at San Francisco, so the casket remained on their hands. By this time, Miss Bonney was invited to accompany an American lady on a visit to California, and accepted gratefully. While she was there, she paid a visit to the prison to inquire whether Uyenishi had ever made any kind of statement concerning the missing pearls. Here she heard of Uyenishi's recent death, and the governor of the prison, as he could not give her any information, handed over to her the casket as a sort of memento. This transaction came to the knowledge of the press, and, well, you know what the Californian press is like. There were some comments, as they would say, and quite an assortment of Japanese, of shady antecedents applied to the prison to have the casket restored to them as Uyenishi's heirs. Then Miss Bonney's rooms at the hotel were raided by burglars, but the casket was in the hotel strong-room, and Miss Bonney and her hostess were shadowed by various undesirables in such a disturbing fashion that the two ladies became alarmed and secretly made their way to New York. But there another burglary occurred, with the same unsuccessful result, and the shadowing began again. Finally, Miss Bonny, feeling that her presence was a danger to her friend, decided to return to England, and managed to get on board the ship without letting her departure be known in advance. But even in England she has not been left in peace. She has had an uncomfortable feeling of being watched and attended, and has seemed to be constantly meeting Japanese men in the streets, especially in the vicinity of her house. Of course, all the fuss is about this infernal casket, and when she told me what was happening, I promptly popped the thing in my pocket and took it to my office, where I stowed it in the strong room, and there, of course, it ought to have remained. But it didn't. One day Miss Bonny told me that she was sending some small things to a lone exhibition of Oriental works of art at the South Kensington Museum, and she wished to include the casket. I urged her strongly to do nothing of the kind, but she persisted, and the end of it was that we went to the museum together, with her pottery and stuff in a handbag and the casket in my pocket. It was a most imprudent thing to do, for there the beastly casket was for several months exposed in a glass case for anyone to see, with her name on the label. And what was worse, full particulars of the origin of the thing. However, nothing happened while it was there. The museum is not an easy place to steal from, and all went well until it was time to remove the things after the close of the exhibition. Now, today was the appointed day, and, as on the previous occasion, she and I went to the museum together. But the unfortunate thing is that we didn't come away together. Her other exhibits were all pottery, and these were dealt with first, so that she had her handbag packed and was ready to go before they had begun on the metal work cases. As we were not going the same way, it didn't seem necessary for her to wait, so she went off with her bag, and I stayed behind until the casket was released, when I put it in my pocket and went home, where I locked the thing up again in the strong room. It was about 7 when I got home. A little after 8, I heard the telephone ring down in the office, and down I went, cursing the untimely ringer, who turned out to be a policeman at St. George's Hospital. He said he had found Miss Bonny lying unconscious in the street, and had taken her to the hospital, where she had been detained for a while, but she was now recovered, and he was taking her home. She would like me, if possible, to go and see her at once. Well, of course, I set off forthwith, and got to her house a few minutes after her arrival, and just after you had left. She was a great deal upset, so I didn't worry her with many questions, but she gave me a short account of her misadventure, which amounted to this. She had started to walk home from the museum along the Brompton Road, and she was passing down a quiet street between that and Fulham Road, when she heard soft footsteps behind her. The next moment a scarf or shawl was thrown over her head and drawn tightly round her neck. At the same moment the bag was snatched from her hand. That is all she remembers, for she was so terrified that she fainted, and knew no more until she found herself in a cab with 2 policemen who were taking her to the hospital. Now it is obvious that her assailants were in search of that damned casket, for the bag had been broken open and searched, but nothing taken or damaged, which suggests the Japanese again, for a British thief would have smashed the crockery. I find your card there, and I put it to Miss Bonny that we had better ask you to help us. I told her all about you, and she agreed emphatically. So that is why I am here, drinking your port and robbing you of your night's rest. And what do you want me to do? Thorndike asked. Whatever you think's best, was the cheerful reply. In the first place, this nuisance must be put a stop to, this shadowing and hanging about. But apart from that, you must see that there is something queer about this accursed casket. The beastly thing is of no intrinsic value. The museum man turned up his nose at it, but it evidently has some extrinsic value, and no small value either. If it is good enough for these fellows to follow it all the way from the States, as they seem to have done, it is good enough for us to try to find out what its value is. That is where you come in. I propose to bring Miss Bonny to see you tomorrow, and I will bring the infernal casket too. Then you will ask her a few questions, take a look at the casket, through the microscope if necessary, and tell us all about it in your usual necromantic way." Thorndike laughed as he refilled our friend's glass. "If faith will move mountains, Broadribb," said he, "you ought to have been a civil engineer. But it is certainly a rather intriguing problem." "Ha!" exclaimed the old solicitor. "Then it's all right. I've known you a good many years, but I've never known you to be stumped, and you are not going to be stumped now. What time shall I bring her? Afternoon or evening would suit her best." "Very well," replied Thorndike. "Bring her to tea, say 5 o'clock. How will that do?" "Excellently, and here's good luck to the adventure." He drained his glass, and the decanter being now empty, he rose, shook our hands warmly, and took his departure in high spirits. It was with a very lively interest that I looked forward to the prospective visit. Like Thorndike, I found the case rather intriguing, for it was quite clear, as our shrewd old friend had said, that there was something more than met the eye in the matter of this casket. Hence, on the following afternoon, when on the stroke of 5 footsteps became audible on our stairs, I awaited the arrival of our new client with keen curiosity, both as to herself and her mysterious property. To tell the truth, the lady was better worth looking at than the casket. At the first glance I was strongly prepossessed in her favour, and so, I think, was Thorndike. Not that she was a beauty, though comely enough, but she was an example of a type that seems to be growing rarer, quiet, gentle, soft-spoken, and a lady to her fingertips, a little sad-faced and careworn, with a streak or two of white in her prettily disposed black hair, though she couldn't have been much over 35. Altogether a very gracious and winning personality. When we had been presented to her by Broadribb, who treated her as if she had been a royal personage, and had enthroned her in the most comfortable easy-chair, we inquired as to her health, and were duly thanked for the salvage of the bag. Then Polton brought in the tray with an air that seemed to demand an escort of choristers. The tea was poured out, and the informal proceedings began. She had not, however, much to tell, for she had not seen her assailants, and the essential facts of the case had been fully presented in Broadribb's excellent summary. After a very few questions, therefore, we came to the next stage, which was introduced by Broadribb's taking from his pocket a small parcel, which he proceeded to open. "There," said he, "that is the Fons et Origo Mali. Not much to look at, I think you'll agree?" He set the object down on the table and glared at it malevolently, while Thorndike and I regarded it with a more impersonal interest. It was not much to look at, just an ordinary Japanese casket in the form of a squat, shapeless figure with a silly little grinning face, of which the head and shoulders opened on a hinge. A pleasant enough object, with its quiet, warm colouring, but certainly not a masterpiece of art. Thorndike picked it up and turned it over slowly for preliminary inspection. Then he went on to examine it detail by detail, watched closely in his turn by Broadribb and me. Slowly and methodically, his eye, fortified by a watchmaker's eyeglass, travelled over every part of the exterior. Then he opened it, and I, having examined the inside of the lid, scrutinized the bottom from within long and attentively. Finally he turned the casket upside down, and examined the bottom from without, giving to it the longest and most rigorous inspection of all, which puzzled me somewhat, for the bottom was absolutely plain. At length he passed the casket and the eyeglass to me without comment. "Well," said Broadribb, "what's the verdict?" "It's of no value as a work of art," replied Thorndike. The body and lid are just castings of common white metal and antimony alloy, I should say. The bronze colour is lacquer." "So the museum man remarked," said Broadribb. "But," continued Thorndike, "there is one very odd thing about it. The only piece of fine metal in it is the part which matters least. The bottom is a separate plate of the alloy known to the Japanese as shakudo, an alloy of copper and gold." "Yes," said Broadribb, "the museum man noted that too, and couldn't make out why it had been put there." "Then," Thorndike continued, "there is another anomalous feature. The inside of the bottom is covered with elaborate decoration, just the place where decoration is most inappropriate, since it would be covered up by the contents of the casket. And again, this decoration is etched, not engraved or chased, but etching is a very unusual process for this purpose, if it is ever used at all by Japanese metalworkers. My impression is that it is not, for it is most unsuitable for decorative purposes. That is all that I observe so far." "And what do you infer from your observations?" Broadribb asked. "I should like to think the matter over," was the reply. "There is an obvious anomaly which must have some significance, but I won't embark on speculative opinions at this stage. I should like, however, to take one or two photographs of the casket for reference, but that will occupy some time. You will hardly want to wait so long." "No," said Broadribb, "but Miss Bonny is coming with me to my office to go over some documents and discuss a little business. When we have finished, I will come back and fetch the confounded thing." "There's no need for that," replied Thorndike. "As soon as I have done what is necessary, I'll bring it up to your place." To this agreement Broadribb agreed readily, and he and his client prepared to depart. I rose too, and as I happened to have a call to make in Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, I asked permission to walk with them. As we came out into King's Bench Walk, I noticed a smallish, gentlemanly-looking man who had just passed our entry and now turned in at the one next door, and by the light of the lamp in the entry he looked to me like a Japanese. I thought Miss Bonny had observed him too, but she made no remark, and neither did I. But passing up Inner Temple Lane, we nearly overtook two other men who, though I got but a back view of them, and the light was feeble enough, aroused my suspicions by their neat small figures. As we approached, they quickened their pace, and one of them looked back over his shoulder, and then my suspicions were confirmed, for it was an unmistakable Japanese face that turned and looked at us. Miss Bonny saw that I had observed the men, for she remarked, as they turned sharply at the cloisters and entered Pump Court, "You see, I'm still haunted by Japanese." "I noticed them," said Broadribb. "They're probably law students, but we may as well be companionable," and with this he too headed for Pump Court. We followed our Oriental friends across the lane into Fountain Court, and through that and Devereux Court out to Temple Bar, where we parted from them, they turning westward and we crossing to Bell Yard, up which we walked, entering New Square by the Carey Street gate. At Broadribb's doorway we halted and looked back, but no one was in sight. I accordingly went my way, promising to return anon to hear Thorndike's report, and the lawyer and his client disappeared through the portal. My business occupied me longer than I had expected, but nevertheless, when I arrived at Broadribb's premises, where he lived in chambers above his office, Thorndike had not yet made his appearance. A quarter of an hour later, however, we heard his brisk steps on the stairs, and as Broadribb threw the door open, he entered and produced the casket from his pocket. "Well," said Broadribb, taking it from him and locking it, for the time being, in a drawer, "has the oracle spoken, and if so, what did he say?" "Oracles," replied Thorndike, "have a way of being more concise than explicit. Before I attempt to interpret the message, I should like to view the scene of the escape, to see if there was any intelligible reason why this man Uyenishi should have returned up Brownlow Street into what must have been the danger zone. I think that is a material question." "Then," said Broadribb with evident eagerness, "let us all walk up and have a look at the confounded place. It's quite close by." We all agreed instantly, 2 of us at least being on the tiptoe of expectation, for Thorndike, who habitually understated his results, had virtually admitted that the Casket had told him something, and as we walked up the square to the gate in Lincoln's Inn Fields, I watched him furtively, trying to gather from his impassive face a hint as to what the something amounted to, and wondering how the movements of the fugitive bore on the solution of the mystery. Broadribb was similarly occupied, and as we crossed from Great Turnstile and took our way up Brownlow Street, I could see that his excitement was approaching bursting point. At the top of the street, Thorndike paused and looked up and down the rather dismal thoroughfare which forms a continuation of Bedford Row and bears its name. Then he crossed to the paved island surrounding the pump which stands in the middle of the road, and from thence surveyed the entrances to Brownlow Street and Hand Court, and then he turned and looked thoughtfully at the pump. "A quaint old survivor, this," he remarked, tapping the iron shell with his knuckles. "There is a similar one, you may remember, in Queen Square, and another in Aldgate, but that is still in use." "Yes," Broadribb assented, almost dancing with impatience, and inwardly damning the pump, as I could see. "I've noticed it. I suppose," Thorndike proceeded in a reflective tone, "they had to remove the handle, but it was rather a pity." "Perhaps it was," growled Broadribb, whose complexion was rapidly developing affinities to that of a pickled cabbage. "But what the Here he broke off short and glared silently at Thorndike, who had raised his arm and squeezed his hand into the opening once occupied by the handle. He groped in the interior with an expression of placid interest, and presently reported, "The barrel's still there, and so, apparently, is the plunger." Here I heard Broadribb mutter huskily, "Damn the barrel and the plunger too. But my hand is rather large for the exploration. Would you, Miss Bonny, mind slipping your hand in and telling me if I'm right?" We all gazed at Thorndike in dismay. But in a moment Miss Bonny recovered from her astonishment, and with a deprecating smile, half shy, half amused, she slipped off her glove, and reaching up, it was rather high for her, inserted her hand into the narrow slit. Broadribb glared at her and gobbled like a turkey-cock, and I watched her with a sudden suspicion that something was going to happen. Nor was I mistaken, for as I looked, the shy, puzzled smile faded from her face, and was succeeded by an expression of incredulous astonishment. Slowly she withdrew her hand, and as it came out of the slit, it dragged something after it. I started forward, and by the light of the lamp above the pump, I could see that the object was a leather bag secured by a string, from which hung a broken seal. "It can't be," she gasped, as with trembling fingers she untied the string. Then, as she peered into the open mouth, she uttered a little cry. It is! It's the necklace!" Broadribb was speechless with amazement. So was I, and I was gazing still open-mouthed at the bag in Miss Bonny's hands when I felt Thorndike touch my arm. I turned quickly and found him offering me an automatic pistol. "Stand by, Jervis," he said quietly, looking towards Gray's Inn. I looked in the same direction, and then perceived 3 men stealing round the corner from Jockey's Fields. Broadribb saw them too, and snatching the bag of pearls from his client's hands, buttoned it into his breast pocket, and placed himself before its owner, grasping his stick with a warlike air. The 3 men filed along the pavement until they were opposite us, when they turned simultaneously and bore down on the pump, each man, as I noticed, holding his right hand behind him. In a moment Thorndike's hand, grasping a pistol, flew up, as did mine also, and he called out sharply, "Stop! If any man moves a hand, I fire." The challenge brought him up short, evidently unprepared for this kind of reception. What would have happened next is impossible to guess, but at this moment a police whistle sounded, and 2 constables ran out from Hand Court. The whistle was instantly echoed from the direction of Warwick Court, whence 2 more constabulary figures appeared through the postern gate of Gray's Inn. Our 3 attendants hesitated but for an instant. Then, with one accord, they turned tail and flew like the wind round into Jockey's Fields, with the whole posse of constables close on their heels. "Remarkable coincidence," said Broadribb, "that those policemen should happen to be on the lookout. Or isn't it a coincidence?" "I telephoned to the station superintendent before I started," replied Thorndike, warning him of a possible breach of the peace at this spot. Broadribb chuckled. "You're a wonderful man, Thorndike. You think of everything. I wonder if the police will catch those fellows." "It's no concern of ours," replied Thorndike. "We've got the pearls, and that finishes the business. There'll be no more shadowing in any case." Miss Bonny heaved a comfortable little sigh and glanced gratefully at Thorndike. "You can have no idea what a relief that is," she exclaimed, "to say nothing of the treasure trove." We waited some time, but as neither the fugitives nor the constables reappeared, we presently made our way back down Brownlow Street. And there it was that Broadribb had an inspiration. "I'll tell you what," said he. "I'll just pop these things in my strong room. They'll be perfectly safe there until the bank opens tomorrow, and then we'll go and have a nice little dinner. I'll pay the piper." "Indeed you won't," exclaimed Miss Bonny. "This is my Thanksgiving festival, and the benevolent wizard shall be the guest of the evening." "Very well, my dear," agreed Broadribb. "I'll pay and charge it to the estate. But I stipulate that the benevolent wizard shall tell us exactly what the oracle said. That is essential to the preservation of my sanity." "You shall have his ipsissima verba," Thorndike promised, and the resolution was carried nem con. An hour and a half later we were seated around a table in a private room off a cafe to which Mr. Broadribb had conducted us. I may not divulge its whereabouts, though I may perhaps hint that we approached it by way of Wardour Street. At any rate, we had dined even to the fulfilment of Broadribb's ideal, and coffee and liqueurs furnished a sort of gastronomic doxology. Broadribb had lighted a cigar, and Thorndike had produced a vicious-looking little black cheroot, which he regarded fondly, and then returned to its abiding place as unsuited to the present company. "Now," said Broadribb, watching Thorndike fill his pipe as understudy of the cheroot aforesaid, "we are waiting to hear the words of the oracle." "You shall hear them," Thorndike replied. "There are only 5 of them. But first there are certain introductory matters to be disposed of. The solution of this problem is based on 2 well-known physical facts, one metallurgical and the other optical." "Ha," said Broadribb, "you must temper the wind to the shorn lamb, you know, Thorndike. Miss Bonny and I are not scientists." "I'll put the matter quite simply, but you must have the facts. The first relates to the properties of malleable metals, excepting iron and steel, and especially of copper and its alloys. If a plate of such metal or alloy, say bronze, for instance, is made red-hot and quenched in water, it becomes quite soft and flexible, the reverse of what happens in the case of iron. Now, if such a plate of softened metal be placed on a steel anvil and hammered, it becomes extremely hard and brittle." "I follow that," said Broadribb. "Then see what follows. If, instead of hammering the soft plate, you put on it the edge of a blunt chisel and strike on that chisel a sharp blow, you produce an indented line. Now the plate remains soft, but the metal forming the indented line has been hammered and has become hard. There is now a line of hard metal on the soft plate. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," replied Broadribb, and Thorndike accordingly continued. "The second fact is this. If a beam of light falls on a polished surface which reflects it, and if that surface is turned through a given angle, the beam of light is deflected through double that angle." Grunted Broadribb. "Yes, no doubt. I hope we are not going to get into any deeper waters, Thorndike." "We are not," replied the latter, smiling urbanely. "We are now going to consider the application of these facts. Have you ever seen a Japanese magic mirror? Never, nor even heard of such a thing. They are bronze mirrors, just like the ancient Greek or Etruscan mirrors, which are probably magic mirrors too. A typical specimen consists of a circular or oval plate of bronze, highly polished on the face and decorated on the back with chaste ornament, commonly a dragon or some such device, and furnished with a handle. The ornament is, as I have said, chased, that is to say, it is executed in indented lines made with chasing tools, which are in effect small chisels, more or less blunt, which are struck with a chasing hammer. Now, these mirrors have a very singular property. Although the face is perfectly plain, as a mirror should be, yet if a beam of sunlight is caught on it and reflected, say, onto a white wall, the round or oval patch of light on the wall is not a plain light patch. It shows quite clearly the ornament on the back of the mirror. "How extraordinary!" exclaimed Miss Bonny. "Sounds quite incredible," I said. "It does," Thorndike agreed, "and yet the explanation is quite simple. Professor Sylvanus Thompson pointed it out years ago. It is based on the facts which I have just stated to you. The artist who makes one of these mirrors begins naturally by annealing the metal until it is quite soft. Then he chases the design on the back, and this design then shows slightly on the face. But he now grinds the face perfectly flat with fine emery and water, so that the traces of the design are completely obliterated. Finally, he polishes the face with rouge on a soft buff. But now observe that wherever the chasing tool has made a line, the metal is hardened right through, so that the design is in hard metal on a soft matrix. But the hardened metal resists the wear of the polishing buffer more than the soft metal does. The result is that the act of polishing causes the design to appear in faint relief on the face. Its projection is infinitesimal, less than the 100,000th of an inch, and totally invisible to the eye. But minute as it is, owing to the optical law which I mentioned, which in effect doubles the projection, it is enough to influence the reflection of light. As a consequence, every chased line appears on the patch of light as a dark line with a bright border, and so the whole design is visible. I think that is quite clear. "Perfectly clear," Miss Bonny and Broadribb agreed. "But now," pursued Thorndike, "before we come to the casket, there is a very curious corollary, which I must mention. Supposing our artist, having finished the mirror, should proceed with the scraper to erase the design from the back, and on the blank scraped surface to etch a new design. The process of etching does not harden the metal, so the new design does not appear on the reflection, but the old design would, for although it was invisible on the face and had been erased from the back, it would still exist in the substance of the metal and continue to influence the reflection. The odd result would be that the design, which would be visible in the patch of light on the wall, would be a different one from that on the back of the mirror. No doubt you can see what I'm leading up to. But I will take the investigation of the casket as it actually occurred. It was obvious at once that the value of the thing was extrinsic. It had no intrinsic value, either in material or workmanship. What could that value be? The clear suggestion was that the casket was the vehicle of some secret message or information. It had been made by Uyuenshi, who had almost certainly had possession of the missing pearls, and who had been so closely pursued that he never had an opportunity to communicate with his confederates. It was to be given to a man who was almost certainly one of those confederates, and, since the pearls had never been traced, there was a distinct probability that the presumed message referred to some hiding place in which Uyuenshi had concealed them during his flight, and where they were probably still hidden. With these considerations in my mind, I examined the casket, and this was what I found. The thing itself was a common white metal casting, made presentable by means of lacquer, but the white metal bottom had been cut out and replaced by a plate of fine bronze, shakudo. The inside of this was covered with an etched design, which immediately aroused my suspicions. Turning it over, I saw that the outside of the bottom was not only smooth and polished, it was a true mirror. It gave a perfectly undistorted reflection of my face. At once I suspected that the mirror held the secret, that the message, whatever it was, had been chased on the back, had then been scraped away, and an etched design worked on it to hide the traces of the scraper. As soon as you were gone, I took the casket up to the laboratory and threw a strong beam of parallel light from a condenser on the bottom, catching the reflection on a sheet of white paper. The result was just what I expected. On the bright oval patch on the paper could be seen the shadowy but quite distinct forms of 5 words in the Japanese character. I was in somewhat of a dilemma, for I have no knowledge of Japanese, whereas the circumstances were such as to make it rather unsafe to employ a translator. However, as I do just know the Japanese characters and possess a Japanese dictionary, I determined to make an attempt to fudge out the words myself. If I failed, I could then look for a discreet translator. However, it proved to be easier than I had expected, for the words were detached. They did not form a sentence, and so involved no questions of grammar. I spelt out the first word and then looked it up in the dictionary. The translation was pearls. This looked hopeful, and I went on to the next, of which the translation was pump. The third word floored me. It seemed to be yokis or jockish, but there was no such word in the dictionary, so I turned to the next word, hoping that it would explain its predecessor, and it did. The fourth word was fields, and the last word was evidently London. So the entire group read pearls, pump, yockish, fields, London. Now there is no pump, as far as I know, in Jockey Fields, but there is one in Bedford Row, close to the corner of the fields, and exactly opposite the end of Brownlow Street. And by Mr. Broadribb's account, Uyenishi, in his flight, ran down Hand Court and returned up Brownlow Street as if he were making for the pump. As the latter is disused and the handle hole is high up, well out of the way of children, it offers quite a good temporary hiding place, and I had no doubt that the bag of pearls had been poked into it and was probably there still. I was tempted to go at once and explore, but I was anxious that the discovery should be made by Miss Bonny herself, and I did not dare to make a preliminary exploration for fear of being shadowed. If I had found the treasure, I should have had to take it and give it to her, which would have been a flat ending to the adventure, so I had to dissemble and be the occasion of much smothered objurgation on the part of my friend Broadribb, and that is the whole story of my interview with the oracle. Our mantelpiece is becoming a veritable museum of trophies of victory, the gifts of grateful clients. Among them is a squat, shapeless figure of a Japanese gentleman of the old school, with a silly, grinning little face, the magic casket. But its possession is no longer a menace. Its sting has been drawn. Its magic is exploded. Its secret is exposed. And its glory departed. So that was The Magic Casket by R. Austin Freeman. Let me tell you something about R. Austin Freeman. So he was born in 1862, 1943 he died. He was a British writer, best known for his detective fiction, featuring the medico-legal forensic investigator Dr. Thorndike. He was born in London, where he studied medicine, became a physician, serving as colonial surgeon in West Africa. So he wasn't just a physician, he was a surgeon as well. However, ill health forced him to return to England, where he eventually abandoned his medical practice. He held conservative political views and supported the eugenics movement, expressing these views in his non-fiction book Social Decay and Regeneration, 1921. I haven't read it, but it's not really for modern taste, I don't think. It's quite offensive, really. Freeman began his literary, and if you don't believe me, look it up. Freeman began his literary career in the early 1900s, collaborating with John James Pitcairn on the Romney Pringle stories under the pseudonyms Clifford Ashdown and Ralph J.J. His first solo novel, The Golden Pool, 1905, drew from his experience in West Africa when he was part of the British Empire. Freeman's most famous creation, Dr. Thorndike, first appeared in the novel The Red Thumb Mark, 1907. He continued to write Thorndike novels and short stories throughout his career, with his last novel, Mr. Polton Explains. Polton, as a butler, has a brief appearance in this one, doesn't he? Published in 1940, so it's 3 years before he died. One One of Freeman's most significant contributions, this is really important, to detective fiction was the invention of the inverted detective story format, which he first employed in his 1910 short story, The Case of Oscar Brodsky. In this format, the crime and criminal are revealed to the reader at the beginning of the story. So basically, it's not a whodunit, which was, of course, the early ones were whodunits. Who did this, you know? And then the modern ones are why done it. We're looking into the psychology of the criminal. But this was a how done it. How was it done? So in that sense, of course, it's similar to Conan Doyle, with whom he is often compared, and Thorndike is often compared with Sherlock Holmes, although he hasn't had the great success that Sherlock Holmes. Neither, of course, of these people are real, but Sherlock's had a great career, but Thorndike not so much anyway. So yeah, in this format, the crime and the criminal are revealed to the reader at the beginning of the story, and the focus is on the detective's process of solving the mystery. So it's from the who done it to how was the discovery achieved, the how done it, as I call it. He's inverted detective stories, including A Silent Witness, 1914, and The Singing Bone, 1912, inspired later works in this subgenre, such as the Columbo television series, because of course that is the same thing. We know who did it, and we know they're guilty. And what we're wanting to do is to wait till Columbo pins it on them. By working out how they did it, which is often not apparent to begin with, as it is in this case. In his early writings, we need to say something about this, or do we? But we're going to say something about it anyway. Freeman expressed anti-Semitic views and racial stereotypes that were, as the article says, unfortunately common during his time. His novel Helen Varden's Confession, 1922, and his non-fiction book, which we've quoted, contain offensive stereotypes and diatribes against Jewish people. However, Freeman's views seem to have evolved over time, possibly influenced by the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. In his later works, such as When Rogues Fall Out, 1932, Mr. Polton Explains, 1940, Jewish characters are portrayed more sympathetically and positively, suggesting a shift in Freeman's attitudes. Maybe they did change, you know. It reminds me of Primo Levi's book, Is This a Man?, whereby he has this scene where the Jewish children, and well, not just children, but people in general, are being herded off, and it's a really hot day, and they're on this station, and it's blazing down, and they've got no water, and the theme music started, so I had to stop it and go on again, and so Primo Levi, Is This a Man? And so one of these Nazi guards on the station goes and gets some water and gives it to a Jewish child whose hands are sticking out. And what Primo Levi does really well is you expect that in a lesser writer, I suppose, that would be engendering sympathy with it. You think, oh, you know, there is humanity in these Nazi guards. There is humanity there. But the point that Primo Levi makes is, you know, he's assuaging his own conscience. He's making himself feel a little bit better at very low cost, and he is still complicit with the whole murder enterprise. So, you know, it isn't as good as it looks. So I just say that because just to kind of throw light upon, by the time it gets to 1940s, moving from very anti-Semitic to not that anti-Semitic isn't really, it won't really wash, I don't think. But this, of course, and that was such a monstrous crime, unforgivable, unforgettable crime, but it raises the general issue of, do we forgive people? Should we forgive people? Are people measured by what they've done? So say I did something wicked many years ago. I'm not comparing it with the enormity of the crime. I'm just kind of casting it in a smaller light. Should I be forgiven if I then change? Maybe. In my job, my career, which is coming to an end now, as working in the mental health field, I used to say to people, a lot of people would come to me and they felt they were bad people, often without any real foundation, and I would kind of explore that in a teasing way. I would say, well, what kind of things do you do that are bad? And most of these people, and very often they were just young people, you know, they would go, well, I just am, you know, and it's like an emotional thing. But what do you do that's bad? And it turned out not much, if anything. But And I would say, do you know what? Bad people are bad. This is my homespun stuff, so don't take it too seriously. And I'm not pretending to be a great philosopher, but if you do bad things, you're bad. That is the only definition of bad. Somebody who no longer does bad things and does good things now is no longer bad. That's what I think. I don't think we should be held ransom by our past, I think. So I believe in repentance and I believe in forgiveness. So, so do I forgive our Austin Freeman? I don't know the man. And I don't think that's my business here. I'm reading his stories because this is a story podcast. And so if we were to dig around, and we don't have to dig very deep for him, but there are many other people, I'm sure, and this is what the media, social media particularly, does all the time. People are living in glass houses, throwing stones. I'm not here to kind of, if I was to do a Roman story about Seneca, I went to a thing about Seneca last week, about Stoicism. And if we were to say, well, do you know what, he did these kind of things, he beat his wife, he kept slaves. I don't know if he did beat his wife, he did keep slaves. We're never going to read any of his work. Then, no, I don't go that far. I honestly don't. So let's have enough of this. Let's put an end to this moralization. I think we have to mention it. We have to say this is this, but we're still reading his story. And you can disagree with me if you want, but that's what I think. That one, his story does not contain anything like that. I mean, yes, it does to the Japanese. It does, but not in a massively offensive way, I don't think. But then I'm not Japanese anyway. You can see I'm dodging from hot stone to hot stone here. But I don't think it is massively offensive to anybody. It just reflects common views of his generation at that time, probably and in Japan as well. I don't know, but you say, God, this is tricky, isn't it? But I'm going to abrogate responsibility and talk about the story. The story was neat, I thought. I thought it was well written. There has been criticism of his writing style, but I wonder to what level that is informed by his politics, or people who disagree with his politics, but they may have good reason to disagree with his politics. They're going to kind of hit him harder than if they agreed with his politics. That's just human nature. So I don't think his writing was bad at all. I thought it was pretty good. I enjoyed it, both the prose and the story structure. So it is a howdunit. So we know that the crime has been. There's a bit of working out what's been done initially. So it's like, well, there's this handbag, what's going on here? And we don't know there's a Chinese vase there that isn't smashed. Although he said an English criminal would smash, which, take that in light of what we've been saying. So then we find out, and then of course, their big lawyer mate, who's very posh, came, at least he's me pretending to be very posh, he comes and gives him the crack. He gives him the lowdown. And then it's like, oh, right, what's happened here? And then, so that's that. But of course, then what we have in common with the classic detective story is we are not given the clues. We don't know any of that stuff. We couldn't possibly have worked it out ourselves. And yet the genius, like Sherlock Holmes, and like many others of the detectives of this era of detective stories, they present it in their brilliance. They are geniuses. They're above human, ordinary humans with their rational and their knowledge, of course. And the key thing, of course, is with Holmes and with Thorndike is they are massively erudite about practical things such as metallurgy. Another thing that struck me here was one of the things that readers really like, my observation, is being given nuggets of knowledge. This was very big during the 70s and 80s. And I remember my mother and father reading books, and they would comment how they'd learned about wines or licenses for horses to go, or the coral reef. And it was very common for writers of fiction to put in very technical details. And I'll tell you who does this brilliantly is Frederick Forsyth. He does lots and lots of research and will present you with knowledge, right? Really specialist knowledge. So you will come at the end of the story having learned something And people like that. And so I did a spy story called False Flag. You may find it somewhere on the internet by Tony Walker. Please buy it. And I did that deliberately as well. There were little islands of knowledge. Now, your creative writing tutor will tell you, don't put all this stuff in. People aren't interested in, they're just interested in character development. That's what creative writing classes think is the only thing worth reading. I'm not convinced. I think narrative's really important. And as I said, I think people like to learn things in fiction as well. But so they'll tell you not to do this, but Frederick Forsyth did it very successfully. It was one of my best-selling books, actually, so perhaps it did work. So so there we are. You learn something. Oh, there's my little grandson coming upstairs. He likes to sit at my desk and control things, but I have to be really careful he doesn't. He renames files by hitting the keyboard randomly, and then I don't know what they are. And there's folders, and I can't find anything again. So I'm going to have to finish now really quickly before he comes and alters this, and it's ruined forever. But I like watching him do it.